This is Taylor Steele with SHAED coming from ACT 2024. It's really exciting to be here as we're talking about kind of all things electrification, probably in this group a little bit specifically fleet electrification, although a lot of things we can cover. I am joined here by Will Quinn of EV Realty and Bryan Jungers of eSource. My background is in infrastructure deployment and development. We can dive into that a little bit more, but I think we can have a really great conversation here about the electrification process and all the things that need to come together to make it happen. So for starters, I think we'll go into some introductions. I would love to hear not only who you work for and maybe what that company is doing, but also a little bit of your background and how you found yourself here. So Will, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Thanks so much for having us. So Will Quinn, I'm with EV Realty. My background is over 12 years of renewable energy and clean tech investment. Previously with Pacific Gas and Electric, deploying EV charging infrastructure for a variety of vehicle segments, light duty, L2 charging, public fast charging, and medium heavy duty fleet charging. And then from there, I head up product within our charging group at Proterra, the formerly largest electric transit bus manufacturer in North America, also a large commercial battery pack manufacturer, and EV charging fleet supporting company as well. So we deployed just over 100 megawatts of dedicated commercial EV fleet charging at Proterra. And now I'm with EV Realty, which is a relatively new startup, about 22 of us now at the company. And we locate really high quality locations on the grid that have sufficient access to grid capacity. Think 5 to 15 megawatts of power available. We purchase the sites, build them out, install dedicated charging infrastructure. We can get more into the style of chargers that we're installing and how we make those decisions. And then serve dedicated commercial electric fleets in the surrounding area. So it's a multi-fleet model. It's not any one type of commercial fleet, but we are dedicated to commercial fleet charging, which would differentiate us from a different public charging network, which may be open to any car that is interested in charging there.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I'm impressed with a lot of things at EV Realty, but definitely I think the utility and power acumen on your team is incredible. So I'm excited to dive in a little bit more. Also, knowing a lot about utilities, Bryan Jungers, tell us about you.
Thanks, Taylor. So my background in EVs dates back to 20 years ago. I was at Davis. I actually met Will there. And after I was at Davis, I went to EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and was on the electric transportation team for a few years, and then went to eSource in 2010. I've been at eSource ever since, and I oversee our mobility practice. So we work with utilities like PG&E, like hundreds of other utilities across the U.S. and Canada, trying to build electrification initiatives, programs for customers, fleet advisory services, helping customers understand and navigate the fleet electrification process. It is new to everyone, essentially, and it's massive. I think most folks underestimate how much effort, how much expense, how much time will be required. And so trying to share best practices across the utility industry. Utilities are mostly unregulated or non-competitive, one or the other, and so they can share information, and so we just kind of gather the best ideas and reshare them out to our members, and that's what I do day in and day out, essentially.
Excellent. Very fun. Very, very important. A little bit about me. I've been building infrastructure my entire career. I actually started in utility scale solar way back in the early days, and then as a relatively impatient young child, moved into electrification on the passenger vehicle side, deploying EV charging stations for Tesla for 6 years across multiple countries. So I had a lot of fun there, and I've deployed thousands of chargers, and I've talked to lots of utilities and also understand kind of the need to bridge this gap, right, that we keep talking about. I am now with SHAED. We are focused on commercial vehicle procurement and a marketplace solution. So what we're really thinking about is, not only, of course, is there a charging and a power problem, right, with once you get these vehicles on the floor or on the road, I should say. Before that, even just procuring a commercial vehicle is a little bit challenging. You've got to get a chassis, you've got to get it upfit, and then you have to make sure you can have a charger. So we're thinking about all those problems. So that puts me in a little bit of a different space. But I'm very excited to be on the commercial electrification side and start thinking about fleets where we can have a lot of impact. I think, maybe one of the first things on my mind is talking about, you had mentioned that a lot of people don't really understand how complicated it is for us to electrify and to move these fleets forward. I would agree. One of the things I find most confusing out there is there's a lot of new fun terms and services that people are providing. One of them we hear a lot is charging as a service. I think a lot of people think EV Realty is a charging as a service provider. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, great. What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll start off and then can use other examples as well. So charging as a service to us means, again, owning and operating the charging assets themselves. Like Bryan alluded to, this is a relatively nascent and can be a complex space for a commercial fleet that's just looking to learn how to electrify. They might not also want to take on the process of running an RFP and identifying all the various types of charging infrastructure providers that are out there. So charging as a service can be scoped as narrowly as just owning and managing the charging station itself. In the case of our powered properties built out by EV Realty, we are owning the properties themselves. So we're handling all of what in the utility industry is known as to the meter and behind the meter infrastructure. So everything from the pole to the parking spot, right? We are connecting from the transformer upgrade from the utility company. We are installing new electrical service panels, doing conduit and wiring, and sizing all of that appropriately for, again, a variety of commercial fleet types. So the types of chargers that we're owning, installing, and operating, we're a big fan of what we call, or what is known in the industry as distributed architecture charging. So rather than maybe like an all-in-one charger that can have the power modules, to get technical for a second, located inside of the same cabinet as the dispenser, we're a big fan of separating the power modules from the dispenser when the sites can lend well to that. And the reason for that, in addition to some cost reductions in construction and site design and layout improvements, is also that it enables you to deliver just a really wide range of power to the vehicles that are charging. So you could range anywhere from, say, 25 to 50 kilowatts up to basically whatever the limit of the battery voltage on the vehicle is, or the amperage limit on the cable. So if we're talking about, a liquid cooled 500 amp cable, you could be getting up to 250 plus kilowatts through a CCS connector. In the future, with megawatt charging cables and connectors, you could go up from there, right? The battery is going to be the constraint rather than the charger being the constraint. So we really like this flexible design because it enables us to serve small vehicles, large vehicles, short dwell times, long dwell times, but the individual customer and fleet operator who shows up doesn't need to think about any of that. It's really simple for them. They plug in, they tell us when they need to leave, and we take care of the rest.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, very descriptive. So thanks for the help there. I think you guys are taking on a lot of ownership in your model, but you don't have to as a charging as a service provider, right?
Sure.
And so I think some folks, really maybe that end owner who has a fleet also wants to own their equipment, and that also could be charging as a service. So are you thinking about the investment more on the infrastructure side?
Yeah, I guess generally my bias towards charging as a service would involve some sort of ownership from the third party, so that the individual site owner or fleet operator that you're referring to doesn't need to own the asset. If there's enough, operators in this space that I'm sure you could find someone that would be willing to manage your chargers for you on your property, and you kind of not think about it as much. Maybe like a charge management software system may offer some type of on-site support, and again, just asset management, so you don't need to think about it. But generally, again, all these terms in the industry are a little bit open for definition, depending on who the investor is giving the pitch or who the startup is giving the pitch. But I think a definition for charging as a service to me would mean that you are owning, operating, and removing all of the limitations, so that a customer doesn't really need to think about any of that, and you can make it really simple for them because of that.
Yeah.
The architecture infrastructure that you describe reminds me of another company on the light duty side called Atom Power. Have you ever heard of Atom Power? And they have, I think, options. So folks can own and operate their own equipment. But if you want to have it managed for you, do managed charging to kind of optimize power usage, that's like a monthly service, right? So sort of a charging as a service on the multifamily and sort of, that side of the market.
Right. Like there's a lot of things to be considered, right? In terms of what is being managed. It can be everything kind of from the front end before it gets in the ground to when the fleet is operating and who's actually thinking about the logistics of these vehicles and their charge cycles and all of that. So I see there's different players in the game, some who are taking a very small piece of that pie and some who want to take a much larger piece of that pie. It doesn't get any simpler. I think at SHAED, what we're trying to understand and figure out is if we want to kind of be the handshake, the warm introduction to the right solution, how do we get enough information from someone who wants to electrify a fleet and the right information and then get that into the right party's hands? Because, there are some folks who are just going to deploy a couple level 2s and maybe can go to their local EPC. And then there are other folks who are going to need a full turnkey solution and financing support as well.
Yeah, a lot of credit to SHAED for trying to figure that out, because I think we are, all of us collectively, trying to electrify the entire transportation market, right? And an individual customer might not know where they fit in that ecosystem, from a school, which may or may not own their own school buses, to a small business, which may or may not own their own vehicles, to your largest transit agencies in the country, your largest package delivery companies in the country. They're all trying to figure this out, right? And some of them can afford maybe certain types of consultants, some cannot. So really appreciate these new business models that are popping up to help serve as an advisory service or a platform which can help direct small fleets, large fleets to the right kind of network of support that they need to electrify their fleets.
Yeah, and I think it's a really fun time, right? Because we keep talking about there's new business models and there's new technology and there's new ideas and a lot of different stakeholders. And, it sounds like you're aligned with me. I have no idea who's going to rise to the top.
Right.
I have no idea who's going to win. I know a lot of really great companies and really great people. And we've also seen tragedies happen to great companies and great people.
Absolutely.
So, what does it look like 5 years from now? I have no idea.
And what EV Realty's doing reminds me a lot of what happened with solar many years ago, where there were too many folks trying to act in the market and nobody knew where the best spots were for solar projects. And so said, look, let's find the best spots and you can kind of go in together and develop in those, we'll put out a bid and you can develop that part of the grid. What's the reception been like from utilities and also from the fleet side of kind of understanding your model and the value proposition that you have? Yeah,
I really appreciate you saying that. Fleets, especially on the smaller side, I think underestimate the difficulty of and the amount of time that it takes to conduct utility upgrades that are needed for these fleets, right? So anything more than 2 or 3 trucks with, say, 150 kilowatt hour batteries or larger, and more than 9 times out of 10, you are going to need some type of utility upgrade, right? So unless you're just signing a really small demo pilot project, you are going to need the utility upgrade. And folks learn that pretty quick, but they don't actually realize what that all entails. You might need to do like a large load study or an engineering review of some sort in which you are paying the utility for their analysis of that. And then you're getting an estimation of how much it will actually cost and how much time it will take to upgrade the grid. As someone who previously worked for the utility company, I have a lot of respect for that process, and it's a very important process, and it's important that it's done, appropriately, and everyone has a right to power on this amazing asset that all of us, arguably take for granted every day. A machine that works 365, 24/7, 365, that we all get lights and power from. So pretty cool what the utilities pulled off. But at the same time, as a fleet operator, maybe you don't want to learn everything about the utility industry or how the grid works or energy and electricity, and deal with 18 months plus sometimes of interconnection times. And I won't throw out exact numbers, but potentially costly upgrades to get your site ready.
If your core business is slinging packages, I don't know how much you really want to be thinking about managing your electric fleet.
Probably not. So our business model at our best has those sites ready for you, in a reasonable distance from your operations, ready to go. We've already had those conversations. We've already upgraded the grid, or rather upgraded the necessary transformers on site, have reserved capacity that already exists on the grid, right? So we're looking for and finding, I should say, locations that don't need upstream grid upgrades. They don't need necessarily like substation upgrades. Again, to get technical for a minute, line segment upgrades. The capacity is actually there, and we have a proprietary software product to help locate those locations on the grid. And we're reserving that capacity. So when our sites are energized and electrified and go live, we have the full 5, 10 megawatts of power coming to us. And now you don't need to go down, I'll say, some other rabbit holes you could go down with. Should I buy some sort of generator or solar plus storage system? Not to throw shade, pun intended, on those systems, because they have an important role to play as well. But if you're a really large commercial fleet, you may not want to think about how to stack that in with solar and storage and generators. And with our powered properties, you don't need to. We have the power, we have the chargers, and ideally we're ready for you.
Yeah, this part of this conversation is reminding me of this fear that I have, that I've thought about. You harken back to the solar days, and one thing that happened in solar is there were so many players that utilities got pretty overwhelmed, and so you're on the generation side, and they started creating these interconnection queues, and people would just hold power positions for years and years and years, and then those businesses would go defunct, and it was a little bit wild and chaotic. And I think this is an example of where a really good idea kind of slowed progress a little bit, in that, you know, a lot of people were just holding power positions for a long time. You guys think there's any risk of that happening on the load side?
I've heard of that queuing already taking place.
Oh dear.
And I don't know. I mean, in Southern California specifically is where I'm hearing there's a lot of queuing in places that are difficult to serve, and they're trying to come up with kind of creative new transmission line installations that will serve like the Inland Empire, or, you know, that desert between Los Angeles and here where we are in Vegas. It doesn't seem like we're over that hill yet, but
I did not have fun in that time of interconnection queues, but you know, I don't know, maybe it could work out. Yeah, it's really interesting to see what's going to happen. The other thing I think a little bit about is the equity play, right? And larger companies with more resources, or a better backed, well-funded startup, might have the resources and frankly money to throw around to buy powered land, or to get a different technology, or whatever that looks like, and develop all these great tools. But I think there are smaller players that maybe don't have that. And so if I think about myself, and instead of being on the developer shoes, which is probably where we operate a lot, I put myself on the fleet owner side. It's hard for me to compete with an Amazon or a Walmart, or name some other large person in the field, right? Because theoretically, those companies could just go build their own substation if they really wanted to, right? If they had a big enough distribution center. Whereas small local distributors don't have that available to them. I'm curious if you guys have thought about any of that.
definitely. I think on the utility incentive program side, there's a lot more realization that the bigger fleets are not necessarily the best candidates for those programs, or the most appropriate for receiving incentives. And there's a lot more, at least, talk about equity and having a more proactive plan for electrification that doesn't leave like the upgrade costs on the last person to connect to the transformer, for example, which is probably, not the wealthiest person on that transformer. I think we're still in the process, because I think a lot of programs are struggling just to get enrollment or get the marketing out that they have these programs. And so in some cases, they're just taking hand raisers. Whoever is willing and able to stay in the program, participates. But I think over time, increasingly, we're going to see you need to be able to serve the small, mid-sized businesses. We need to have carve-outs for disadvantaged communities where, who are you actually serving? Where are we actually electrifying? Because that's where the public funding needs to go, not all to Amazon. Nothing against Amazon.
Yeah, to build on that a little bit more, I mean, one of the reasons I'm really motivated to work in this industry is the myriad positive knock-on effects that occur from electrification, right? So the health impacts, the asthma impacts, American Lung Association, Heart Association have put out good statistics and valuing those, changing from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. So to be California-centric for a minute, right? Central Valley air quality impacts, greater Los Angeles area air quality impacts. It's really inspiring and it gives me some hope to think about converting those spaces into having class 3 through 6 or class 3 through 8 trucks that are no longer powered by diesel anymore. Could do some simple looking into it, just really surprises me how many kids still sit in diesel school buses, for example. So I'm just really excited to see that transition happen. And the emphasis on corridor charging and being near freeways, I think, is important for its own reasons. But I hope that we can also recognize that these air quality impacts and localized pollution impacts aren't necessarily always near a freeway corridor, and maybe more of a kind of a history of being near industry or warehouses or, ports or some of these locations. And so to go after those sites in particular and figure out basically whatever it takes to get those sites comfortable electrifying is what really excites me. So a little bit more of the hub and spoke model and the depot charging model, and last mile is kind of a term that gets thrown around a lot, but means different things to different people. Last mile, middle mile, being smart about where we place those things, I think is going to have a really large impact on these cities and these areas that have been impacted. And that's just really exciting to be a part of that.
Yeah, and I would agree. I don't think there's a single answer, and I get in these conversations all the time where folks are kind of like, okay, is it corridor charging or is it urban charging? I'm like, well, it's both.
Yeah.
Like, is it L2 or is it fast charging? It's both.
Yeah.
It's all of the things, and I think we need to be thinking about it as a whole, I guess, ecosystem of charging and electrification solutions. And sometimes people are really looking for a silver bullet, but I really don't believe there is one. I think we have to think pretty broadly. As I guess a bit of an anecdote about how we learned that at Tesla, Tesla started the supercharger network with this idea of like, okay, the road trip, the EV road trip, how do you get from California to New York in an EV comfortably and happily? That's a really great first step. I'm not sure they knew they were going to go beyond that. I thought they were just like, and it's done, and now everyone can own an EV and be happy. And at some point on that journey, there was this realization that actually there are a lot of multi-unit dwellers and urban use cases where folks don't have a garage and can't charge, and that local transportation is really critical. I don't actually think that's much different than a fleet use case. I think you've got to be thinking about both. You have to be thinking about long haul just as much as you're thinking about last mile, middle mile drayage.
Agreed. Yeah, all the segments are needed to electrify. I do think there's maybe a little bit of sequencing that could happen.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Total cost of ownership for vehicles is happening in a specific way, and battery costs largely drive that. So look to the kind of markets and customers to see what vehicles they're interested in electrifying. And then I think that they're, again, can stack kind of serve multiple segments, have multiple benefits by going after maybe some of the most crowded or areas that lend best to electrification. I don't know that that's necessarily always urban per se, but I think that it's go where the trucks are, right? Go where they're driving, go where it makes sense that the fleet needs help, and locate the infrastructure in a way that helps them the most, because that's going to make it easy for the businesses to electrify.
Yeah, 100%. Curious question for you, Bryan. So I think that Will and EV Realty are the gold standard, maybe the green standard of like finding power and like figuring out that power is a really critical component to what we're doing. And, I had a former colleague who always told me that we are married to the utilities, so we can't hate them. And I think that's very, very true. And changed a lot of perspectives. From your perspective, you spend a lot of time working with utilities all day, every day. You're their best friend. What should others know about like the importance of power and finding power?
And I mean, it's kind of seems cliche to say it, but talk to them early. It's one of the things we hear the most frequently is that the utility wasn't brought into the conversation until 6 months, year, 2 years down the road after this plan's been in place, and we've worked with all the other stakeholders, and nobody thought to like engage the utility in the process. A lot of utilities publish a lot of information publicly. You can go and find the capacity plan. You can go and find their resource plan. You can figure out what the priorities are of the utility if you want to know. You might not want to know all of that, so at least...
Or you can talk to people who figure that out for you.
Or you can have good friends who are good friends of the utility. That's the other thing. Someone who really understands the utility industry, speaks the language, can be a go-between. Yeah. I mean, as much as some people may hate middle people in the market, they're very needed, especially in this early markets. They play a vital role, and I can't even overstate how valuable those folks are when you have really good partners.
Yeah. We've been, in a couple rooms together, and I remember about a year ago we had this incredible forum together, specifically talking about fleet electrification. And one of my favorite conversations in that room was about this question, right? Which is, utilities want to know where trucks are going, and the fleet operators want to know where the power is, and both parties are saying, well, they didn't tell me. Which is just like this really funny question. And that's, to your point, is like where it's very important to have someone, an expert in the middle that knows and can bridge that gap. Be it, are we sending vehicle registration data to utilities, or are we going to utilities early and saying, hey, here's my 5-year plan on electrification? I think that communication bit is really critical, and I think we've been making strides, and eSource is doing a really excellent job in facilitating these meetings and getting the right people in the room, but we got to keep doing it and doing a lot more and having big expos in Vegas and all that.
Definitely agree. I think ACT is putting in an effort to try to make this more of a utility-friendly fleet conference. I think I was just at a fleet meeting a few weeks ago. There were no utilities there. One of the multinational fleet leaders came up to me after and said, I learned so much from your 5-minute talk that you just gave. I'm like, great. Now bring some more utilities in for your next meeting. Like, we got to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. I think we have to keep the conversation going, and I think we also have to... I was having this... And please correct me if I'm wrong here, because I just had this thought a couple days ago and I could be very wrong. But I was like, the solar industry has like SIA, like they have people that are gathering information and doing things and have subcommittees and networks and all that sort of stuff. I don't know that like the electrification space has that in the same way. And like, I don't know, maybe it's time, close.
It's fractured much like the market. Well, you've got EPRI, you've got SEPA, you've got some folks that have been in it for a long time. And there's kind of like, I don't know, little fiefdoms. But there's starting to be some more legitimate collaboration happening across these organizations. But they're often pretty big and old and have their way of doing things. And so they're relearning as well.
Say no more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased to see agreement on certain fundamental standards existing in this industry, right? OCPP has existed for a while for the software of the charge controls. We're trying our best to standardize interconnection or the connectors to the chargers without going down a whole CCS versus NACS debate. But all of us want to be aligned on those connectors and those fundamentals. I think back to the really early days of EV charging, for folks who know Better Place was I believe Israeli startup that was doing some battery swapping, and a lot of the chargers that they deployed, some of which received various funds, when they went bankrupt, they weren't able to be used anymore because they couldn't get any new software onto the chargers. That should never happen again. I want to say it never will happen again because I don't know every single individual business's underlying business model, but it should never happen again because we all have ways to flash new software into these chargers, to use standardized commands, to standardized sets of communication protocols, and increasingly the hardware as well is becoming standardized. So I still think there's a lot of room in approach and how you design sites to be thoughtful and drive out cost and deliver a high quality experience for the customer. But that really, takes a lot of fear I have out of this market, that we've agreed on some fundamentals, and now any vehicle OEM and essentially any charging OEM can come together and speak the same language from day one, rather than having to do a whole bunch of interoperability testing to make sure that they play well together.
Yeah, and it harkens back to, I was lucky enough to spend a couple years in the UK and across Europe deploying charging infrastructure. And I think they've had regulation on OCPP and OCPI for quite a bit longer, but we can also look across the pond and across the globe for other places that I think are electrifying and really forward thinking. And sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we live on our North American island, and we forget that there are countries that are actually much further ahead, maybe smaller, but much further ahead in terms of adoption of electric vehicles.
Yeah, and there have actually been a lot of companies from the UK in particular coming over and kind of bringing their technology and their market to the US fairly recently. So I think there's increasing opportunity for that.
Yeah, I don't think we're shy of opportunity in this space and in this industry, which is really exciting. What else do we have that we want to talk about?
Maybe just to remind folks of kind of the magnitude of the fleets that we're dealing with here, or the power challenge that we're dealing with, right? So maybe for some analogies, I don't know the exact size of a Walmart supercenter, but I think it's somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 megawatts of power when you include air conditioning load and things like that, or maybe even just 1.5 megawatts in some instances. And then again, a commercial fleet, you can probably, a small fleet of 5, 10 vehicles. If you don't need to charge them too quickly, you can probably get away with something like 500 kilowatts, let's say, of on-site power. But if you get into a bigger fleet, 20 plus vehicles, you want to charge them quite quickly, you find yourself asking for 3, 4, 5 megawatts of power. You're getting into 80 vehicles, 100 plus vehicles, and some of them you want to charge as soon as possible. Maybe you want to use the new megawatt charging standard when that becomes more widely available. You're now talking about 5, 6 Walmart supercenters of power. You know, multiple Transamerica buildings of power.
Yeah, in one small location or parking lot. Right? That has to be really well organized, but that's a different kind of conversation. I think we often forget the magnitude, and especially those of us who live in this space and operate it and can like think about it, because we've been thinking about it for a long time. But yeah, it's a huge amount of power, and we're sub 1% electrified on the fleet side.
Exactly.
So we got a long way to go.
Exactly. So I don't want to have folks take for granted the magnitude of that, and how not all locations in the country and on the grid will be able to accommodate that much power. You can't just go to the utility and say, I want this much power. That's not always possible for when you're talking about numbers that big. So
they also don't like it when you say like that. That's really nice. You have to say pretty please. It's a whole thing.
It's also for the utility, from the utility side, it's a completely different way of thinking about the customers, because you have a really small customer from a utility perspective that wasn't using a ton of power before, and now suddenly in their parking lot, they're a key account for your utility now. And so we have our key accounts like reps, like, all right, how do we deal with these new customer class?
Yeah, I remember when I was deploying, public charging infrastructure, and, I was finally able to convince the utility of how much power I was using. And like, they looked at it and they're like, oh, you're a key account. Do you want to go to a baseball game? And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
But more importantly, I want power. We had to kind of educate on this, not only from the amount of power that we're using, how much that's going to help ratepayers, because ultimately we're paying for the power. Like, money goes somewhere. But the other thing is this load operates very differently than a Walmart supercenter. We're not talking about baseload power. Yeah. We're not talking about a very what do you call that, predictable load profile. It is right. It's different, it's diversified, and that takes education too.
Yeah, maybe riffing on the ratepayer aspect for a minute here, right? I think there's going to be a variety of ways that we deploy this infrastructure, but you can do it in a thoughtful way too. So to the extent that you can utilize existing capacity that already exists on the grid, the substations have already been built out, the line segments have already been built out, you don't need new infrastructure for that. Therefore, you don't need an impact on ratepayers to power those vehicles. I think there's an appropriate, planning and upgrading of the grid that needs to happen as well. So I don't mean to imply that isn't going to happen. It is. But to the extent that we can utilize spots on the grid that maybe had a large manufacturing facility or warehouse, or, I don't know, steel smelting or something, whatever it is, right, that no longer exists, we should be going after those spots first, because they already exist.
Yeah,
and we need to spend money on them.
Jungers from DOE said recently that the capacity factor on the grid today in the United States is lower than it was in like the early 70s. We actually have more slack capacity available throughout the entire grid. But is it where you need it, or are you able to use it appropriately? And that's the trick.
Right place, right time. It's a good one. Yeah, well, I think we covered a lot. I think it was pretty good.
It was great.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess I'll just say thank you guys for coming. This has been really exciting. I hope we continue the conversation and kind of do more of this stuff. And, as we go on and carry out into ACT, we have lots more conversations and opportunities to partner and meet more stakeholders. So thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Taylor.
Great. Thanks, Taylor.